Morning, everybody. It's Dan Webber here, the Regional Manager for CDE in Australasia. Thanks, everybody, for dialing in today. We've just wrapped up a session on natural quarrying in the Sydney Basin, which was really exciting and really interesting. The guys from Corkeries and Eco Rock did a wonderful job. So those people that are joining us from that session will have, I think, thoroughly enjoyed that. But we're moving on to a very related topic, which is around resource recovery and diversion from landfill. And we're very lucky to have Mike Ritchie from MRA joining us to kick things off. He's going to run through a quick presentation. I had the privilege of seeing it quickly this morning, and it's great to see what I think we see intuitively or hear talk about anecdotally in some hard data. And I think the companies like MRA that are at the forefront of helping, particularly our client base, get permits and approvals and strategically make decisions are pivotal in making good decisions and having the right capital deployed in the right places in the right parts of our cities to I guess, reach our recycling goals and targets and make for a more sustainable society, which I guess is holistically where all governments and societies are driving. So CDE is really excited about the future of the space. We love being involved in it strategically. It's where our business is going and investing heavily. And so I guess without me prattling on for too much longer, I'll hand over to Mike to take us through his content, and we'll wrap that up after that with a bit of a panel discussion. So we'll digest what Mike's talking about and maybe talk about some more sort of holistic Australia-wide topics and outputs with some other teams. We'll introduce them later, but Mark Smith from Waste and Recycling Queensland, who's been running around the state madly, talking about stockpiling. Mike, who I've just introduced, Marcus Barber, who I've again talked to recently, and pretty thought-provoking discussion. He made me think about some things when we chatted, so I think he'll contribute a lot. And then Mike Wheeler's going to facilitate that from Inside Waste, and I thank Mike for getting on the line and helping with that, because I think he's got a deadline today. So we all know how that is. So yeah, without further ado, I'll hand over to Mike and we'll kick things off. Thanks everyone for joining in today. If you have any questions, please use the Q&A section and just write your questions, and we'll try to come to them as we go.
Thanks very much, Daniel. Mike Ritchie, MRA Consulting. Thanks for that intro. The brief I got was to kind of give a bit of an overview of what's happening around the C&D space, what's happening in terms of waste policy across the country. So let's start with the broad outline. Doris, are you good to go?
Yeah. Hello. It's just going to bring up your presentation.
So we don't have a presentation yet?
Yeah, it's up there.
All right, next slide. Great. So every state and territory has its own targets for waste diversion from landfill. You'll see the New South Wales ones there, just to pick an example I've highlighted in the red circle. 70% diversion of household waste, 70% diversion target for commercial, and an 80% diversion target for construction and demolition waste. And the solid bar below that is where is the sector at the moment in terms of performance. So you can see that in New South Wales, for example, construction and demolition recycling rate's about 74%. It's sat above 70% for the last 5 or 6 years. The reason for that is C&D is highly recyclable. They're relatively consistent streams: concrete, steel, masonry, rock, stone, dirt, fines. So you can get a high recovery rate as compared to commercial waste, where we're getting maximum kind of 30 to 50% recovery rates. And household waste, we get about a 60, 70% recovery rate through sorting technologies. So C&D lends itself towards higher recovery rates. But what you can see there is also a line at the top at about 80%, which is the new national target established by the Meeting of Environment Ministers last year. We now have an adopted national waste strategy, which sets an 80% diversion from landfill target for all states, territories, and all waste streams. So while the C&D targets, as you can see across the board there, have ranged from about 70% up to 80%, there's now a national target of 80% by the year 2030. So we're not there yet, and governments are using landfill levies to try and drive us in that direction, and I'll talk about landfill levies in a moment. Next slide, please. Okay, no, here we are, Doris. So you'll see there, 80% target by the year 2030. Am I doing this, Doris, or are you?
No, she's.
All right, next slide. All right. Waste is like a river. It flows downhill to the nearest price, to the cheapest price. And in 1996, we generated about 23 million tonnes of waste in that river. We recycled about 7% of it, and we landfilled 21 million tonnes of it. So in other words, we landfilled 93% of everything we generated. In the year 2019, using the latest data, we generated about 55 million tonnes of waste, and we recycled about 32 million tonnes of it, or 56%. But interestingly, down the bottom, we landfilled almost exactly the same amount of tonnes. We hadn't reduced the amount of tonnes in the last 20 years. So if we're going to get to an 80% target, we need to do a lot more work on our waste streams than we've been doing historically. And it's going to be a big ask. In fact, to get to the national target by 2030, we need to double our historic recycling rate across all waste streams in the next 9 years. We need to catch up about another 18 million tonnes of recycling in 9 years. We need to grow our recycling rate by 2 million tonnes a year. Now, we have been growing it at about 1 million tonnes a year, so we need to double the growth in recycling every year for the next 9 years to hit those targets. So is that possible? Well, it's possible, but only with the right market and pricing signals in the market that allow construction and demolition operators, to talk about that sector specifically, to succeed and to be able to create wealth and create profits from what is an increasingly difficult stream to recycle, because all the low-hanging fruit's already been taken. So to get from 70 up to 80% requires orders of magnitude more work to capture that last 10%. Next slide, please. And there's the national target. We're going to get that number to 80%. Thanks very much. Next slide. All right, so let's look at the historical trajectory. The blue line is the growth in waste generation across all streams in Australia, household, commercial and construction. The yellow is the growth in recycling, and the red is landfilling. And energy from waste piddling along the bottom. You can see that a couple of things. Waste generation continuously grows at between 2 and 4% per year. And that even if you project forward the recycling growth rate, in the year 2030, we will be 9 million tonnes short of where we need to be. And from where we sit today, we need to grow the recycling rate by 18 million tonnes over that 9-year period, or as I said before, 2 million tonnes of growth in recycling each year, every year. And construction and demolition has to do its bit in that story. Next slide. Yeah. All right, just go back. You've just jumped ahead. No? Okay, sorry, my bad. Next slide. So there's really only a couple of instruments that government can use to get to grow our recycling rate by 18.5 million tonnes in the next 9 years. And they're going to have to get serious about the regulatory signals and the price signals in the market. And they're really, as I said before, there's really only 4. You increase the levies, and levies have done most of the heavy lifting in terms of that growth in recycling in the last 20 years. They are by far the most important economic instrument. And we don't have many regulatory instruments in the Australian economy, unlike Europe. So price is the thing that drives investment in construction and demolition. That price is driven by making the opportunity cost of landfilling more expensive, which means that recyclers can come into the market charging a gate fee that's just underneath the landfill price, and they'll get the tonnes. Compare that to Queensland, where the landfill price was $30, and there was almost no recycling happening in Queensland in the last 20 years, which is why the state government has introduced a landfill levy, and has also driven away 1 million tonnes of New South Wales waste back into New South Wales, because it was arbitraging the movement of waste out of Sydney up to Brisbane, because it was cheaper to landfill it in Brisbane and transport it all that distance than landfill it in Sydney. Which is just bad public policy. So the two streams to focus on are construction, demolition and organics, or FOGO, food organics, garden organics, that's what FOGO stands for. An energy from waste platform, which we don't currently have, though we're building one, and some limited extended producer responsibility and circular economy initiatives around banning particular product streams. And I'm going to spend the rest of the presentation talking about the key instruments in those four elements. And keeping in mind that we're doing this to grow our recycling rate by 18 million tonnes in only 9 years. Next slide. And that's what the economy needs to look like by 2030. You can see that is what 80% looks like. Given a generation rate of about 70 million tonnes, we need to recycle about 56 million tonnes of it, and landfill only 14. So for the first time in the last 30 years, we will need to actually reduce the amount of waste to landfill in material terms, as well as grow the recycling rate in material terms. Next slide. Right, so let's talk the landfill levy part of that story. And this, to my mind, is that the construction demolition industry have been they've been price takers in the market. They haven't been advocating to government nearly as strongly as they need to make sure that everybody understands the benefit of the levy and price signals in terms of making construction and demolition recycling profitable and worth investing in. And we know it is worth investing in because we have major investors coming into the waste market now to invest in construction demolition companies, to invest in commercial waste companies, because primarily of the effect of the levy in driving up profitability and investment in the sector. This slide is some analysis done by MRA, just showing the relationship between levies on the horizontal axis and the recycling rate that derives from it on the vertical axis. And it shows, obviously, that the higher the levy, the higher the recycling rate in that state. And the size of the ball is the amount of recycling that's going on. So you can see that South Australia and New South Wales have the highest levies and have the highest recycling rates, closely followed by Victoria, who's doing pretty well for other reasons, but the landfill levy in Victoria is also rising, and they have announced the rises in the levy in advance. So industry is investing in advance of the levy being higher. So there's a little bit of distortion in the Victorian number. And then WA, ACT are sitting at around that $60 to $70 a tonne. Northern Territory, Tasmania, no levies, very low recycling rates. It's not rocket science. The higher you make the levy, the more investment you get in construction and demolition recycling, and the higher your recycling rates. Next slide. Oh, by the way, on that slide, if you look across all the data, the levy itself represents about 70% of explaining the variability of the data. So in other words, the levy's doing by far the bulk of the heavy lifting. These are the levy trajectories in the last 15, 20 years. You can see New South Wales in light blue has set by far the highest levy, and as therefore has the highest recycling rate and the highest tonnage movement in those diagrams in the previous slide. So that's the import of the levy, clearly demonstrated in New South Wales. South Australia and Victoria, dark blue and orange, you can see are rising up to that $120 to $140 per tonne levy mark. And that's what's driving Macquarie Bank to buy into the waste industry, buying Bingo for $2.6 billion, etc., is they see this trajectory continuing and long-term profitability, long-term investment horizon, long-term infrastructure plays. What we see, Queensland increase its levy from $0 to $70, rising to $90 in the next 3 years, going up by $5 a year. West Australia have done very little. They're the red line there, just tipping along at about $70 a tonne. And Northern Territory, Tasmania, not on that slide at all. Tasmania has announced a $20 per tonne levy starting next year and rising to $50. Next slide. The effect of the levies is obviously the landfill gate fee that you and I see when we take a tonne of waste to the landfill. These are the PUTE what I would call shingle prices, the price that you and I see on the weekend with the trailer. They're not the prices that big companies in the audience will be doing deals for long-term landfill disposal. But you can clearly see the trend where levies have been introduced, the landfill price is higher. There's a bit of a typo there on the Brisbane one. That's supposed to be $150 to $190 a tonne now, with the rise in the landfill tax of $70 rising to $90 over the next 3 years. Thanks.
I didn't get that. Could you try again?
If you're going to recycle, the things to recycle are the things still sitting in the waste to landfill component, which is the centre of that river flowing downwards. A note to point out, the 32 million tonnes over on the left is primarily construction demolition waste and organics. So they are by far the best performing recyclers in the economy, way ahead of domestic waste and commercial waste. But it still leaves a lot of tonnes in the middle of that river. 7 million tonnes of organics, 6 million tonnes of construction and demolition waste still going to landfill. Why? Two reasons. The economics don't work in some cities like Hobart and regional towns where they've got low landfill prices, and also materials that are in regional areas that have a high transport burden to get it back to a market. So those tonnes become increasingly difficult to get out, but if we're going to hit an 80% target, as agreed by governments, that's where we need to focus. So 6 million tonnes of mixed commercial waste, 3 million tonnes of tyres, 2 million tonnes of paper, 2 million of plastic, almost 1 of textiles and carpet, and 500,000 tonnes of metals. And you can see you've got to start at the top of that, at that list, with organics and C&D waste are by far the priorities at this stage. Next slide. Put it another way, what does the economic cost curve? So there, the previous slide was the tonnages. This is the cost of doing it. So it's all very well to say, well, we should recycle organics, but is it incredibly expensive to recycle organics or relatively cheap? The answer is it's relatively cheap, as is construction and demolition waste. This curve is the marginal cost curve of recycling the next tonne. And you can see that most of the materials are above the line, meaning they cost money to recycle. Metals and cardboard recycle themselves. They have enough economic value to cover the costs of transport, logistics, sorting, selling it, whatever. Whereas everything else on the cost curve is subsidised by someone. And particularly if they're very cheap landfills, then that subsidy is a bigger subsidy relative to the cost of landfilling it in a cheap landfill. So the point of landfill levies, they drive that bottom line axis upwards, and they make more materials economically rational to recycle because they are cheaper than landfilling it. So it's a very, if people say it's a blunt instrument, well, yes, it is, because it's a powerful instrument that affects all waste streams. So adding a tax lifts that blue line on the bottom upwards and makes more things fall below the indifference cost curve. So people will go out and recycle concrete in more marginal locations or in smaller tonnages because it's still profitable to do it in a rising landfill environment, or rising landfill tax environment. But you'll also see way up on the top right, plastic bags, cigarette butts, CDs, returned food. They're incredibly expensive to recycle per tonne. And yet governments keep going there, politicians keep going there. But you'll send the economy broke trying to recycle single-use plastic bags around this country and sending 10-tonne trucks up driveways to pick up single-use plastic. It's ridiculous. What we need to do is just ban them from the economy so that they don't arise in the first place. Is a better way of dealing with many of those waste streams. And to the government's credit, they banned single-use polystyrene beads and other materials like that just last month. So far better to ban them than to try and send, the reverse logistics, big trucks, etc., to try and recycle these things when they're way up the top of that cost curve. Next slide. And that's my point, that As you raise the levy, the cost curve goes up. Just another point about hypothecation of the levy. A comment that I often get is, well, we as an industry pay the governments about $1 billion rising to 1.5 billion in the next 4 years in landfill taxes across this country. So there is plenty of money for government to give back to invest in infrastructure builds. And I would encourage everyone on the call to be encouraging governments to invest in construction and demolition infrastructure. They haven't done so up to now because C&D has done so well in a relative recycling rate. But it becomes increasingly difficult, as I mentioned before, to get that last 10 or 20% of C&D waste. So the industry actually does need support to invest in infrastructure and kit to go forward. There's plenty of money that industry is paying, or in fact the economy is paying through the fees and charges we charge our clients. But you can see that New South Wales in this curve is only sending back 15% of the levy they raise. Victoria 15%, West Australia 23%, South Australia 25% of the money they raise is spent back in the industry. Whereas New Zealand, as you see in the middle there, raises a lot less money but spends all of it almost in supporting industry and infrastructure investment. So that's where we need to do some serious advocacy to governments to say, come on, you've raised all these taxes, the industry still needs a bit of a fillip and a leg up if we're going to get to 80% by 2030. Next slide. Second stream to focus on, construction, demolition and organics. I'll just jump through this quite quickly. Those are the two streams that I mentioned in that previous curve. 7.2 million tonnes of organics still going to landfill, 6.5 million tonnes of construction waste still going to landfill. Next slide. If we do the same graph for C&D waste in New South Wales, next slide, you'll see the gap that we're kind of on track with C&D now in New South Wales to achieve the current target, but we're 2 million tonnes shy of where we need to be by 2030. So it's a 2 million tonne upside of infrastructure growth that we need to achieve in the next 9 years. Next slide. I've just been given the hurry up, conscious of time. If you look at Queensland, the gap is 2.7 million tonnes of future growth that we need to do in C&D infrastructure from where we sit today. Next slide. And Victoria, it's about a 1.6 million tonne gap to get to the 80% target. So that's the kind of investment horizon for the three biggest states. It's about 6 million, 7 million tonnes of investment that we need to put in play. Next slide. And this is the kind of stuff that's coming through in a high landfill environment. Bingo has just spent $100 million on this piece of kit, the gorilla, as I call it. $100 million, 700 tonne an hour, and we need and shall see a lot more bits of kit like this if we get our market signals right. Not to say that all the small operators aren't doing a great job, but we've got to go for the increasingly difficult 10%, so we need better optical sorting equipment, better mechanisms in order to get that last remaining 10% out. Next slide. Next slide. Keep going. A couple of quick comments on organics. 7 million tonnes to landfill. It's the only material stream that contributes to Australia's greenhouse gas footprint in landfill. Rock, stone, rubble, masonry don't contribute anything in a greenhouse gas environment, whereas organics represents 3% of Australia's total emissions profile, so we need to get it out. Next slide. And the biggest way that's happening is by introducing food and garden organics bins at the household level. Not a major issue for the C&D sector. I just wanted to let you know that coming to a suburb near you will be food and garden organics bins. Next slide. Changing tack completely now to what else do we need to do to get to 80%? We need to build energy from waste systems in this country. Europe, America all have big incinerator portfolios instead of landfills, and we're seeing that trend now. There are really three types of energy from waste: incineration, which is literally burning the waste in oxygen and capturing all of the gases and purifying them. Gasification is doing something similar temperatures, but limited oxygen, limiting the amount of oxygen, and that causes waste to volatilize, and you get what's called a syngas, which you can then burn and generate electricity from it. And pyrolysis, which is completely starving the process of oxygen, which generates high quantity of syngas, but also a biochar. And that char can be used as a charcoal in steel making, but it can also be ploughed into land as a long-term storage of carbon. Like just reversing the digging up of coal essentially by creating charcoal and burying it again. So that's less developed technology, but we're certainly on our way. These are the mass burn incinerators or gasifiers that are proposed for Australia. They're all in the planning process or being built at the moment. The two in WA are being built as we speak. They're about 400,000 tonnes a year each. And if you look at New South Wales, there's 6 plants coming through the process, about 2 million tonnes of processing capacity between them. A quick point to make, that even if you burnt all of the thermally available waste in Australia, it would only represent about 2% of Australia's electricity demand. So you don't do waste to energy to generate electricity. Sure, it generates baseload electricity, but it's never going to meet our electricity demand. Solar renewables will do that. But what it does do is provide baseload and an alternative to landfilling. Next slide. Last couple of slides about circular economy. This is Mike Ritchie's view of circular economy, not to overcomplicate it, get it all on one page. We need to design to put stuff into the economy so that we can recycle it properly. There are no controls on the inputs to the economy at the moment in terms of design rules, and we need much better controls on the back end so that we can recycle stuff better. But the economy itself is pretty efficient at moving stuff through it. We don't need to play it there. We need to play at either end of the economy. And whenever people talk about circular economy, it all gets very waffly. If we just did the things on that list, we'd move a long way towards creating a much more circular economy. Next slide. The last slide, I think, I just wanted to finish by saying we do this because we make money. We do this because we want to eliminate landfill. We do this because the governments have set a national target of 80% by 2030. But more importantly for me, we do this because we need to create some sustainability for our kids and grandkids. The recycling industry already abates 10% of Australia's greenhouse gas emissions by recovering aluminium, steel, whatever. We save virgin product being manufactured, and therefore we save energy. There is another 50 million tonnes of abatement going to landfill right now in the embodied material, the embodied energy in materials we're currently landfilling. We need to get that out. That would reduce Australia's emissions by another 10% or 50 million tonnes. So, for a whole lot of other reasons, we need to create a more circular economy, but not the least of which we need to address climate change, and we need to do it quickly by doing, as a minimum, those 4 or 5 things. And that, I think, is it, Mr. Chair. That's just reminding us what we've got to do in the next 9 years. It's a big ask, but it can be done, and industry have done an incredible job in the last 20 years. We just need the right signals, and industry will invest and get on with it in the next 9. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. That was spot on. I'd invite the other panelists to turn their computers and their microphones and their cameras on. I've taken a lot of notes, and anyone that knows me thinks I'm probably going to have an opinion or two to pass along the way to digest all of that. But just to reintroduce the rest of the panel now, and you're by no means off the hook, Mike, so stay around. So Mark Smith, CEO of Waste Recycling Industry Queensland. Thanks for joining us there, Mark. Marcus Barber, I think beaming in from Victoria, is that right, Marcus?
Yeah, correct.
So you can sort of ask some pointy questions on the back of what we've all just seen there, and then Mike Wheeler, Mike, if you I guess to take us through some of the scripted content now, then that would be great, and we'll see where we end up in the next sort of 20 minutes or so. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, thanks, Daniel. And thanks, Mike, for such a great insight into where the industry is at the moment. I guess for the first question, I'll throw it to Mark Smith up in Queensland. So we'll talk about, Mike went through some of the issues surrounding trying to reach that 80%. And being the business that you're in, we're just interested in some of the things that you see, some of the barriers towards the circular economy that when you're dealing with government, etc.
I think something that we often see happening out of environmental departments across the country are economic considerations made with how things like the landfill levy work. Sometimes these areas in government make some of these decisions within an environmental context, and I think not enough consideration is given to some of that economic consideration. You know, Mike's presentation highlighted the fact that business is willing to invest when they know where things are going, and often that 3, 5, or 7 year horizon is just not provided for our sector and for a lot of the businesses that need to make those investments. I think that's one of the major barriers that we see.
You're on mute, Mike.
Sorry. Yeah, sorry. Came on and came off again. Sorry, Marcus. Yeah, if you can just give us your opinion on the presentation with regards to how we can make the circular economy better or more user-friendly, I guess.
Yeah, I think that slide that Mike put up that showed the bookends of the two parameters. What are the design elements that are going in terms of how we design products in the first place and how we design buildings for that matter? And then what is the process at the end of it? I think it's absolutely spot on. We are really efficient in Australia at moving stuff around. We do it at speed. We do it generally pretty well. But that kind of thinking that says we'll just design something for the sake of it means that we get products that cannot be unpacked. The e-waste is the key example of that. But also in the building sector where we design buildings that are really hard to dismantle. They can be demolished but not dismantled. And I think that's the whole design parameter up front that has a massive opportunity for how we might be able to enforce or encourage increased rates of recycling across all material sectors.
And bringing it back to you, Mike, do you agree with that? Mike,
yeah, totally. I mean, we need design rules. One of the issues for Australia is, of course, we're a big importing nation, so our ability to control design in other countries is limited. But at the same time, we do need an approval mechanism in Australia at the development end of things, which says if you're going to build stuff and import materials for buildings, for example, then they have to have an end-of-life solution. It's just insane that we still have, for example, it's not a building issue, but we still have packaging brought into this country which is not recyclable. Yet we have the packaging industry claiming that it is recyclable. We have no systems to recycle it, but it's technically recyclable if someone invents a silver bullet or a new mousetrap. Now that is a nonsense. We're going to end up in the same situation as we are with PFAS, as we are with asbestos, where we have these materials that have massive long life, major hazards, and we don't have a way to get them out of the economy or reprocess them or recycle them. We want to get to 80%. We have to, tamp down on the things we can control and make sure we do that as well as possible. In the meantime, fixing these kind of longer term legacy problems from past bad decisions like asbestos.
Yeah, it's so true. I just want to go back and just something you mentioned on your presentation, Mike, is I actually interviewed Trevor Evans yesterday as Minister of Environment or Associate Minister of Environment, and he absolutely brought up your point about all the levies going into consolidated funds instead of going back into the industry. I'm just wondering, Mark, what can we do to persuade government at state level to get those levies in? Because Trevor Evans is actually on board thinking a lot more money should definitely go back, but he says it's not up to him. So,
yeah, I think echoing some of the points raised earlier, there is a need for there to be a consistent message from business about the need to spend, those landfill levies down. But I think part of the challenge that we have here is that there isn't a lot of transparency around what happens with that levy collection and how that money is then distributed. We're currently investigating how grants are distributed across each jurisdiction in Australia, looking at who receives funding and who doesn't. And, our preliminary kind of investigation has found inconsistencies with a number of organisations kind of double dipping into those landfill levies, whether it's through exemptions that are granted by state governments or a situation where we see, local governments and the private sector competing for funds, or community groups and private business competing for funds. And I think there's a lot of discussion around how state governments decide to communicate around what they're spending, and it's not done in a consistent or transparent format. And I think that's partly intentional.
Well, you're going to say something, Mike?
Yeah, I just wanted to make the point about, while hypothecation and the expenditure of the levy is important, it's a 5 out of 10 issue. The height of the levy, the magnitude of the levy is the 10 out of 10 issue. It's what drives investment in the marketplace. It's not whether businesses get a grant or not out of the levy. That's nice to have, but it's not what drives investment decisions, and it's certainly not what has driven the last 20 years of recycling growth in the economy. What has driven that has been the magnitude of the levy and companies being able to predict long-term profitability and return on capital investment. You can't do that from a grant. A grant is a one-off win-lose. It doesn't actually translate into an investment horizon. So while it's nice to have higher hypothecation rates, it's nicer to see more investment, which will bring forward that investment horizon for companies that win grants. It in itself is not the key issue. The key issue is, what is the magnitude of the levy, and can we predict that forward 5 years? Because if governments come out and announce the levy is going to be $40 higher in 5 years' time, that allows companies to make their investment decisions today with some certainty, knowing what the investment position, the economic position will be in 5 years' time. That is far more important than whether they get a grant today or tomorrow. So I just want to make that point. One's a kind of an A issue, and the other one's a B or a C issue.
To that point, though, I guess Mike and Mike Wheeler, I think we've got another question from the floor to come to, but I was just going to comment on that. There's a graph that you showed, Mike Ritchie, which showed the trajectory of waste generation and recycling, and in 10 years, those two lines have mirrored each other. So we need to bridge that gap. So potentially, what we should be focusing our dollars on is investment required to bridge that gap. And you highlighted the materials which are dropping through the funnel, which need to be going off to the right of screen. And, there's still C&D waste going straight through the funnel and into landfill because it's too complex. It's in regions. And I guess this is a trend that we're seeing now is the blurred lines between, C&D and C&I. They're just words on a piece of paper, right? But this is real stuff made of things. And as simple as two different skip bins or a different truck holding different material. Marcus, I think you're waving your hand, mate.
Yeah, just on that, having worked on a lot of building sites from a project management point of view, we have what's known as dump skips. They are just large, big buckets that we dump stuff into. And if we're talking about between 25 and 30% of all material that lands on a construction site going back out as waste, and yet we continue to have these skip bins that don't enable easy separation of materials either on-site or post-site. I mean, there are opportunities for skip manufacturers here to quickly redesign existing skips, to have the hard rubber waste on one side, to have the NDF materials, the wood materials, the wire materials, the copper that goes in, to be put into a skip so when it's collected, it's already pre-sorted. It's not a difficult fix to do simple things like that. And what that then does is redesign the thinking on-site for how materials being used. It's not just the results of the recycling sector to try and get this right. We have to change the actual design and operational phase, even on-site, as a building's being deconstructed or constructed.
Totally agree with that, Marcus. And again, I come back to the landfill levy as being the key driver that makes the manager, builder, owner of that development think, bloody hell, it's worth the labour to do that bit of on-site sorting because I'm going to save a mozza on not having to dispose of it.
Yep.
And the levy makes that decision, we're not in an indifferent territory anymore. We're not in a confusing, maybe this, maybe that. It's got to be black and white. Yep. Recycling has to be the default option for waste management in this country.
Correct.
It has to be in every decision that it is more expensive to landfill it or burn it than recycle it. And it isn't at the moment. For 50% of waste in this country, it is still cheaper to landfill it than to recycle it. Now, what rational company or rational individual is going to recycle when it's more expensive than landfilling? And more complicated and more labour intensive and more, if we don't get the economic signals right, we're just, doing the proverbial wind of the wind.
Correct.
Yeah, it's a really great point. I guess trying to, you've got to get government and industry on board all together. I've got a question from the floor here. I don't know who can answer this one. What is the status of the waste gasification projects proposed in Victoria? Does anybody want to take that?
There are 2 approved in Victoria, Recovered Energy Australia and GSWT Energos in Victoria. They're both about 150,000 tonnes. They're approved but not built. And they're out getting finance and getting contracts of supply from councils for household waste, primarily those 2 facilities.
Just going back a bit, Mike, on one of your slides, you talk about the EFW, and it looks like it's not really, I'm not going to say it's not worth doing, but it's not as much as I thought it would be in terms of how much waste can be used to do that. So is all that investment worth it that's going on at the moment? Or is it just it just looks great for the politicians and the different,
I should update that slide. I'll do a calc which says what is that 2% as a function of baseload power, because as renewables grow and coal declines, then the percentage of baseload of waste to energy will rise. So that will be an interesting number. I don't know that number as we sit here today. But you don't do waste to energy to generate electricity per se. You do it, it's primarily a waste disposal tool to avoid having to landfill that material after all of the available recyclables have been taken out. So it's a disposal mechanism for the residual of the residuals, the way I describe it. And that's government's policy setting is we certainly don't want to be burning and incinerating recyclable materials. A big gap in our policy settings right now, by the way, is they set these rules for energy from waste, but the equivalent rules don't apply in landfill at the moment. You can landfill anything you like in Australia. You don't have to recycle compulsorily before landfilling, but you do have to in the energy from waste space. It's a nonsense gap in our public policy. But what's good for the goose has to be good for the gander.
Yeah. So I've got another, thanks Mike. I've got another question. I'll bring Mark Smith into this one. Should there be more pressure put on people by adding up the levy? What is the ultimate boundary of adding a levy? Where is the balance point? And we should consider both sides of the equation if we want a sustainable solution.
I'm not sure what you mean adding up the.
I'm just saying. Well, I think by making it higher and higher and higher as you're going.
Yeah, definitely. But I think, alongside the policy settings around how the levy is predicted to rise, giving business that clarity, the other side to this equation is really around how we ensure there's an even playing field. So it's all good and well for the levy to be increasing, but we need to make sure that people aren't engaged in activities that really attack the integrity of what the levy is about. This has to do with misclassification of materials and effective regulation of material, because that is a real risk to how the landfill levy system works. This also includes exemptions that are granted to businesses that allow them to basically dump waste without paying the appropriate fees. These kinds of activities by either illegal operators or exemptions granted by government without appropriate consultation really, in many ways, attack the sovereignty of businesses that are making investments into facilities or equipment and people to run effective operations.
Marcus?
Yeah, that's true. I think I did a systems map for the City of Greater Dandenong when we were looking at the waste problem that was emerging through Victoria in terms of storing, in particular, some of the plastics material. And what we're starting to see, or what we've seen develop in Australia, is the similar model that happened in the UK, where interesting parties managed to get hold of contracts for collecting waste, were paid up front for that collection. As part of the contract, they were supposed to be recycled. But what we actually saw, these large warehouses being packed to the roof and then set on fire. And that wasn't an accident. That was a deliberate business model that developed inside the UK as a result of the kind of contractual obligations. Now, arguably, I say arguably, a similar model may be emerging in Australia, and I don't know. My job's to say, this looks interesting. I don't really know. But what we are seeing is certainly edge players. We know through the south there of Dandenong, and there was a couple of players with high activity of police involvement, EPA involvement, state government bodies at the moment, chasing a couple of operators who are running really cheap ads for collection of material, not sorting it, and we're discovering stuff in real estate paddocks that are being opened up for new domestic supply of housing, suddenly discovering buckets and buckets and buckets of asbestos and other materials that have been dumped. So the other issue with this problem is when we increase the levies, that creates also the opportunity for edge players to emerge and doing illegal activity. What we don't also have is a commensurate increase in penalties, personal and financial penalties for someone to take that kind of action. So we need to also balance the stick as well as doing the encouraging for those who would be legitimate operators in terms of waste disposal and collection.
And that balance should also look to include, like we've said earlier, about the product stewardship kind of element around construction. Yes. Is that those penalties need to actually go up the food chain and look at the waste generators as well, which we don't necessarily see much attention on.
Yeah, that's right. A few years ago, I did some work with the Australian Building Construction Commission. As part of that project, I suggested what they ought to be doing if they really wanted to drive change in industry is make it illegal to demolish a building. All buildings that would need to be deconstructed. Now, you couldn't do it with existing stock, but if you change the design for architects and building developers so the building is pulled apart, that allows you to recycle all that material. It means that you change the parameters and design up front rather than set there, because, coming back to Mike's point, it's a really easy thing to do to just dump waste at the moment, and the expense isn't high enough. The levies are now driving some of that change, but maybe not quickly enough.
Isn't one of the main issues also... Sorry, Mike. Yeah.
Just an aside to that, we proposed to the government that they dismantle buildings for the purposes of recovering asbestos prior to it being just smashed down, commingled asbestos into all waste, turns the whole pile into waste. Into rubbish. Loads, which must be landfilled. It's a nonsense that we're asking the C&D operators to somehow spot, microns of asbestos, when we could have a regulatory environment that said it must be dismantled prior to demolition, and that all that asbestos needs to be packaged and landfilled sustainably. Now, you use the levy to fund things like that. And there's now micro-dotting systems that we propose to governments left, west and crooked, that a council inspector goes in, sprays the asbestos with a micro-dot. If it turns up in a paddock, it's absolutely traceable back to the developer. Ping, you busted, mate. Simple solutions that treat materials with the value they need to be treated, rather than saying, "Oh, we'll just fill a hole up with this useful stuff." CSIRO brought out a study the last couple of years ago that said we're landfilling $8 billion worth of metal. Yeah, we are. But at the moment, it would cost you more than $8 billion to get it out and recover it, because our system is dysfunctional. Yeah. Our public policy principles are wrong. They're set up the wrong way.
Yeah, I worked with the management team of one of the mining companies, Australian mining companies, a few years ago, and they were talking about to close a mine and it becoming a little bit not quite really profitable. And I said, don't close it. Start putting in contracts in place to collect e-waste, because you're going to mine per 3 tonne of e-waste, you'll get your 1 gram of gold versus 30 to 100 tonnes of raw material you have to dig up to get that 1 gram of gold. Be sensible in terms of how you're pulling things apart. They went, yeah, but we dig holes. Yes, but you said you're a gold miner. Let's collect the gold. You said you're a materials. Let's collect. Oh no, we wouldn't know what to do. Okay, fine. Yeah, it's not difficult.
I've got a couple more questions. So, and again, I don't know who knows the answer. I think maybe Mike, because you are in New South Wales. How much glass waste in New South Wales, and how much is recycled at present? So what percentage of glass waste is recycled at present?
I'll tell you the Australian story because I know those numbers better. We generate 1.2 million tonnes of glass bottles cullet per year. Our current recycling consumption is 300,000 tonnes. And that's because we only put 30% recycled content into a bottle. Visy have announced, and you've probably seen the newspaper ads, that they're going to grow the recycled content from 30% to 70%. That's a really good thing. That will lift our 300,000 tonnes of recycling up to 600,000. Well, that leaves exactly a gap of another 600,000 tonnes of glass fines primarily, shitty small stuff, that's got to go to another use. And whether that's, well, essentially it's going to be road base and asphalt. There's no other major uses. There's a bit of work being done around smartcrete and putting it into concrete, shredding the glass down into fine, 100 micron type size and putting it in concrete. But its primary use is going to be road base. But for at least 600,000 tonnes.
It's an interesting one, Mike, in that it's a big number, but it's a small big number, and we find the economics around glass is always tricky. We make C&D recycling plants 150, 300 tonnes an hour, and then someone comes and talks to us about a glass recycling plant, and the quantities are 15 tonnes an hour, 3 days a week. And it's sometimes really hard to make that capital investment stack. But the second part of that is we need to be upcycling. And I think sometimes the easy route is we would go bash the stuff in some roads somewhere. And, the best place for a glass bottle is to end up as a glass bottle again. So I think Visy's commitment to that is really profound. And there's other packaging players in the market, and I hope that they follow suit, because that's what's going to drive the real recycling of that material, rather than I don't want to call it pseudo recycling, because the guys who are putting it into beneficial uses are doing a great job. It's better than warehouses full of glass. But we also need to challenge ourselves with every waste stream to try and send it to its highest end use and beneficiate it along the way.
Totally agree.
Probably nearing the end of the session, so I've just got a couple more questions. I'll go back to Mark to start us off with this one. What is the future of recycling? So just put your soothsayer's hat on, and how much virgin material will we still be using? I mean, if we all take everything to its nth degree and everything's been globally recycling, how much virgin material do you think we'll still need?
Look, I potentially might upset some people when I say this, but I always think that there is going to be waste when we think about it as a product that I no longer want, but inherently still has some value. So I think our sector is going to be around for a long time, and the way that we use materials is such a challenging topic, because I think the easy thing is that when things get a little bit difficult or government needs to suddenly kickstart something, they're always going to default back into traditional incentives around construction, or how we might speed up something is looking at a traditional way of doing it. I think some of what we're talking about is innovative ways of thinking, innovative ways of building. And I think with some of the government's initiatives about bringing onshore processing back because of the waste export ban, we can see a lot of opportunity with how we decide to use secondary resources. I do think there'll be a diminished amount of virgin resources, but I don't think we're ever going to get to zero. That's just my opinion there.
Marcus, I spoke to you recently, and you don't think we even do recycling in Australia at the moment. So what are your thoughts on that? on.
Yeah, we don't have a recycling system at all in Australia. We have a collection, gather, and store. Show me the products. Show me the recycled products that have been made out of material that we have collected. Show me the stuff where it's mandated by governments that certain materials must be in road bases, in footpaths, in bollards, in parks. Show me the products. Show me the dismantled e-products that have been reconverted into new products. There aren't any. We've conned by a 3-arrow symbol that suggests we can do recycling. We don't do it in Australia. We have the potential. We have the collection model. We have the storage model. We don't have the product development model. So if we talk about consumers, we're seeing consumers becoming far more active. So at the moment, you've got governments that are sitting in the middle. You've got consumers demanding improvement. You've got the industry demanding improvement. And governments that used to lead up until sort of the mid-70s, they used to lead society, are now lagging in their thinking. They are beholden to 2 or 3 stakeholders. Who wins? Who loses? Who is doing the same? We are going to need virgin materials, but we should not need anywhere near the volume. From an embedded energy point of view, from a value point of view, it only becomes waste once you throw it away, and that is shifting your profit from the inbox to the outbox willingly. We don't have a recycled system in Australia.
And looking at some of those comments that Mike Ritchie was talking about earlier in terms of market levers, like let's let the economy in the middle, that blue box, do its thing with the right settings. If I look to the example of London, we have clients up in that part of the world who say, why would I open a natural sand and aggregates quarry when I've got this supply of material just pouring out of the city?
Yep. Correct.
And they've been bold, and they guarantee their products. They say this concrete is good enough. It's this. I'm happy to build this car park, or maybe they're not going to build an airport runway out of it, but leave virgin extracted material for the right places. But let's let the market settings, let people be entrepreneurial, and there's some macroeconomics at play here outside of even the industries that we focus on. We lost some industries in Australia over the last 2 decades, and I'm sure that they will come back if people are allowed to go back to business.
Yeah, correct. But all levels of government, federal, state, and local, ought to be mandating in their purchasing policies, in their tender documents, a much higher percentage use of recaptured material. It's ridiculous we just allow that to disappear, in my opinion.
I totally agree. I'll just make the aside that says, name me another policy sector where a tax generates jobs 3 to 1, from 3 to 1 more than business as usual. I mean, it's a no-brainer for government. They get a revenue stream they can spend on roads, schools and hospitals. They get a revenue stream they can provide grants and subsidies to industry, and they grow jobs 3 to 1. The more they increase the tax, the more jobs they grow. And the more they create a circular economy. Tell me another sector that has those kinds of economics driving it. There isn't one. And it is just insane that we are still sitting here having a debate about 56% recycling. 46% of everything we generate in the economy goes into a big hole, and we cover it in dirt every night. Explain that to me.
Yeah. All right. I think we're out of time, actually, Daniel. So I'll just leave it to you to wrap it up. But thank you very much. It's been fantastic.
Yeah, no, really enjoyed it, guys. And I guess we've dipped our toe in the water with this format, and I've certainly really enjoyed this session and the one prior to it. And so thanks to everyone for taking part. Thanks, Mike, I said again, for the meaty content to start us off there. It's really nice to see the hard facts. And then a lot of this other stuff is pretty emotional. You can see we're all quite passionate about it, and all of our clients are, and the community. So, this is going to be evolving, and I think we're going to have more chats along this line. And then, as Marcus, you pointed to at the end, what we need to hope for is that the chat is across all levels of government, so that we can start to get a bit of a straight line to the target, because it is different for market to market, and arbitrage is a thing. It's real, and again, people are going to take the shortcut to make a buck if they can. So, it's been really wonderful, guys. Thanks, Mike, for facilitating that last session. I know you got that deadline to get done today, so good luck with that, and thanks everyone for partaking. I think we've got some content in the handout section, some information from MRA, some stuff there from CDE, but thanks everyone for dialing in, and those who are going to dial into some of the other V-Event stuff taking place over the next couple of days on contaminated soil and some of these other related issues. I hope you enjoy that. So that's thanks from me, and thanks to the panelists.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Andy.
Thanks all.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Cheers, guys.
Bye-bye.
Have a good one.